Good morning, everybody. How are we all doing this morning? I hope you all are having a wonderful day as we take on another funky bunch at Sunday Brunch Podcast. How are you all today? I hope you've got your coffee, and I hope you're ready to just sit back, listen, and enjoy. So, if you remember from the last two podcasts, which was last week and then like a month ago, we were going over the RPG, and we finally finished the main genre of the RPG. We're ready to jump into the subgenres now, but first we're going to go over a very quick overview of what a role-playing video game is. A role-playing video game draws its gameplay from traditional tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. Most of these games gas the player in the role of a character that grows in strength and experience over the course of the game. By overcoming difficult challenges and or defeating monsters, the player gains experience points, which represents the character's progress in a chosen profession or class, such as melee combat or ranged magic spells, and allows the player to gain new abilities once a set amount are obtained. Many RPGs contain an open world known as an overworld, which is usually populated with monsters. That allows access to more important game locations, such as towns, dungeons, and castles. Since its emergence of affordable home computers coincided with the popularity of paper and pencil role-playing games, this genre was one of the first in video games and continues to be popular today. Gameplay elements strongly associated with RPG, such as statistical character development through the acquisition of experience points, have been widely adapted to other genres such as action-adventure games. Though nearly all of the early entries in the genre were turn-based games, many modern role-playing video games progress in real time. Thus, the genre has followed the strategy games trend of moving from turn-based to real-time combat. The move to real-time combat began with the release of Square Enix's Final Fantasy XIV. This game used the active time battle system. This was quickly followed by truly real-time action role-playing games such as the Mana series, Soul Blazer, and Ultima 7. Although older turn-based systems still exist, such as Golden Sun series for the Game Boy Advance, as well as Pokemon. Alright. And that was our quick and dirty overview of the RPG. We're now going to jump into these subgenres. So first up is the ARPG, or the Action RPG, or the Action Role-Playing Game. This is a subgenre of video game that combines core elements from both the action game and the role-playing genre. So, the games emphasize real-time combat where the player has direct control over the characters as opposed to turn or menu-based combat, while still having a focus on character stats in order to determine their relative strength and abilities. These games often use action game combat systems similar to hack and slash or shooter games. Action role-playing games may also incorporate action-adventure games, which include a mission system and RPG mechanics, or massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPGs, with real-time combat systems. So the history. 1970s and early 1980s. So Allgame listed the following games released prior to 1984 as action RPGs. Temple of Apshai and its sequel Gateway to Apshai, Beneath the Pyramids of the Apple II, Bokosuka Wars, and Sword of Fargol. These all released in 1979, 83, 83, and 83. Jeremy Parrish of US Gamer claimed that Adventure, 1980, was an action RPG. Bill and Matt Barton claimed that the Intellivision games Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 1982, and Treasure of Tarman, 1983, were action RPGs. Sean of Touch Arcade notes that Adventure lacked RPG mechanics such as experience points and permanent character growth, and argues that Gateway to Apshy is the earliest game I'd feel comfortable calling an action RPG, but notes that it doesn't fit neatly into our modern genre classifications. Though it came closer than Bokosuka Wars released the same year. It's hard to compare games from almost 40 years ago at this point and say that something was, is fitting a modern definition, because our definitions change quite drastically. Our definitions change as new technology emerges, as new everything emerges. Like, we're going to adjust how things are. We're going to adjust because we can. It's like, oh, we've got RPGs now, and this one is, moving in real time. Well, that's not traditional. So I guess we gotta update the RPGs to add this in. Heck, I'm sure a lot of people resisted the urge to go from pen and paper to a computer and call that an RPG. That's a video game. That's different than Dungeons and Dragons, which is all told by one person, and we write things down, and we've got miniature playables on the table. It's like, well, yeah, that's why what was considered an RPG back then with Dungeons and Dragons is considered a tabletop RPG now. It's just, yeah. It's crazy with the fact that, growing up in the period where computers were just becoming affordable for homes. And, just in my mind, I can kind of pick out points where it's just like my entire family had one computer in the house. That didn't change until, somewhere in the 2000s, where my mom got her own computer. And then there was the family computer, and my mom had a computer. And then we upgraded the family computer, and the old computer, which was failing a lot, became the gaming computer. But then that gaming computer only lasted as long as, we had stuff. As long as, it was working, we had a gaming computer. And it's just look at me now. I've got 2 computers right here. I've got 2 laptops over there. I've got 2 play laptops over there. I got a work laptop over there. So all in all, I have, 2, 4, 6, 7. I personally have 7 computers right now surrounding me. I could turn them all on right here, right now, and use them all. And I got this thing. I can play games on this. That was much easier to play. I can play RPGs right here with more processing power than computers 20 years ago. It's like, it's hard to go back and compare things to today's standards. If you want to compare things from 40 years ago to today's standards, you have to change your definition to back then. And that's a issue I have with a lot of things. People are like, things were so different back then. Everything was so different back then. And that's why it's just you need to embrace the fact that if you want to look at all this from the past, you need to accept that it will be different. Because what was acceptable was different. What was capable was different. Everyone who came out with something new was almost always groundbreaking. Now we only get groundbreaking games or groundbreaking technology, groundbreaking consoles every 5 years, maybe 10 years. Which, guess what? That happens. because now instead of being amazed by what people are capable of doing, people are just like, you could do better. When somebody comes out with something new, it's like, this game should be looking better and have better options. They should have known better that people weren't going to like how this ARPG was gonna play. It's like, so if you don't want it, don't buy it. But you should also remember that, yeah, just because some people do things, some people are able to do things, doesn't mean it's a cost viable strategy. You know, right? We've got people who have spent thousands of dollars on PCs, right? Top of the line, everything. And they can play and mod a game to the point that it looks next gen or better. But like, okay, you wish your console could do that? Okay, are you willing to shell out $1,000 or so bucks for your next console? No, you want your console to stay $400? Then you're going to have to accept that in order to make a game that everybody can play, that you gotta cut costs. I don't know. We kind of went on a rant right there. My bad. Oh well. Anyway, continuing on with the 1970s and early 1980s. Jeremy of OneUp.com argues that Japanese developers created a new brand of action RPG game. These new Japanese games combine the role-playing genre with arcade-style action and action-adventure elements. Sean Musgrave of Touch Arcade also traces the genre's roots to Japan, noting that the Western game industry of the time had a tendency to treat action games and RPGs as separate things for separate demographics. Jeremy Parrish also argues that action RPGs were popularized in Japan by the Tower of Druaga. It was released for arcades in June of 1984 and was intended as a fantasy version of Pac-Man, with puzzles to solve, monsters to battle, and hidden treasures to find. Its success in Japan inspired the development of Dragon Slayer and Hydid. Dragon Slayer, Hydid, and Courageous Perseus vie for position as genre precedent, according to John Szepina. And there was an ongoing rivalry developing between the Dragon Slayer and Hydilde series over the years. The Tower of Draga, Dragon Slayer, and Hydilde were influential in Japan, where they influenced later action RPGs such as YS, as well as The Legend of Zelda. Falcom's Dragon Slayer, created by Yoshio Kiya, is the very first action RPG ever made, according to GameSaid Watch. Originally released for the PC 8801 computer in September 1984, it abandoned the command-based battles of earlier role-playing games in favor of real-time hack-and-slash combat that required direct input from the player, alongside puzzle-solving elements. In contrast to earlier turn-based roguelikes, Dragon Slayer was a dungeon crawl role-playing game using real-time action-oriented combat. Combined with traditional role-playing mechanics, Dragon Slayer's overhead action role-playing formula was used in later games. T&E Soft's Hydilde, released in December 1984, was created by Tokihori Naito, who was influenced by the Tower of Druaga. It was the first action RPG with an overworld. The game was immensely popular in Japan, selling 2 million copies across the platforms. According to John, it cannot be stated how influential Hydilde was in the ARPGs which followed it. The same year, Courageous Perseus was one of the earliest action RPGs. I literally cannot say that game, and every time I've attempted to say it, it has changed significantly. Hydilde. Hydilde? Sure, I can type it out. It is, I can't type it there. That one does not work. I have to type it here. Okay, it was Hydlide. Hydlide. Hildlide? Hedild. I don't know. Anyway, continuing on. Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu, released in 1985, billed as a type of new role-playing game. It was an action role-playing game including many character stats and a large quest. It also incorporated a side-scrolling view during exploration and an overhead view during battle. And there was an early karma morality system, where the character's karma meter will rise if he commits sin, i.e., killing good enemies, which in turn causes the temples to refuse to level him up. Xanadu Scenario 2, released in 1986, was an expansion pack created to expand the content of Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu. Hydlide 2 Shine of Darkness 1985 also featured a morality system. Eurogamer cites Farlight 1985 as an early action RPG. Alright, moving on to the late 1980s. An important influence on the action RPG genre was the 1986 action-adventure The Legend of Zelda, which served as the template for many future action RPGs. In contrast to previous action RPGs such as Dragon and High Dildo, which required the player to bump into enemies in order to attack them, The Legend of Zelda featured an attack button that animates a sword swing or projectile attack on the screen. It was also an early example of an open-world, non-linear gameplay, and introduced new features such as battery backup saving. These elements have been used in many action RPGs since. In 1987, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, implemented a more traditional RPG-esque system, including experience points and levels with action game elements. Unlike its predecessor, Zelda 2 more closely fits the definition of an action RPG, and I will agree with that. Zelda 2 is, I would argue, much more of a what's the word I'm looking for? It is much more of a action RPG than most of the other stuff. Simply because it's got the experience points, your stats boost, you get more magic, you get more health, you get more attack power, which you can choose yourself what you want to level up. Every time you level up, you get levels, you get experience by defeating enemies, you know. Zelda 2 is absolutely an ARPG. And I would like to see Zelda experiment again with an ARPG. I've tried to play the original Zelda and Zelda 2, but the style and gameplay of that is just so different. From what I'm used to in terms of like The Legend of Zelda and everything else. That is just, for me, it's hard to be able to just jump in and say, oh yeah, I want to pick this up and play it. Like, it's very traditional. Very 8-point and 16-point respectively. You know? So they're not working with much. It's incredibly open-worlded, where you have to solve puzzles and things by, like, exploring and finding other things. It's not super straightforward. And also, the game's super unfair. Like, I can beat Breath of the Wild, the Skyward Sword, all that blind. But I will flat out tell you, I cannot beat Zelda 1 and Zelda 2 blind. The gameplay is very unforgiving. The puzzles are very unforgiving. And it's just something that I would not necessarily enjoy bashing my head against a wall, figuring them out. But that's just me. But anyway, moving back on. Another Metroidvania-style action RPG released that year was System Satcom's Sharp X1 computer game Euphoria, which is possibly the only Metroidvania-style multiplayer action RPG produced, allowing two-player cooperative gameplay. The fifth Dragon Slayer title, Sorcerian, was also released that year. It was a party-based action RPG, with the player controlling the party of 4 characters at the same time in a side-scrolling view. The game also featured character creation, highly customizable characters, class-based puzzles, and a new scenario system, allowing players to choose from 15 scenarios or quests to play through in order of their choice. It was also an episodic video game, with expansion discs later released offering more scenarios. Falcom also released the first installment of the YS series in 1987. While not very popular in the West, the long-running YS series has performed strongly in the Japanese market with many sequels, remakes, and ports in the decades that follow its release. Actually, YS is still popular today, and I think they just got a new... one soon here. YS. Video game series. Games. Yeah. YS9. Monstrum Nox. Just released 2 years ago. I know close to nothing about the YS series. Anyway, continuing back. Besides Falcom's own Dragon Slayer series, YS was also influenced by Hildildo, from which it borrowed certain mechanics such as health regeneration. The Fairy Tale Adventure offered one of the largest worlds at the time, with over 17,000 computer screens without loading times. That's impressive. Unless what they're considering as a computer screen. Well, no, if you think late 1980s, no, yeah, that's legitimately a lot loaded in at one time without loading times. I'm impressed. In 1988, Telenet Japan's Exile series debuted and was controversial due to its plot, which revolves around a time-traveling Crusades-era Syrian assassin who assassinates various religious historical figures, as well as 20th century political leaders. The gameplay of Exile included both overhead exploration and side-scrolling combat, and featured a heart monitor to represent the player's attack power and armor class statistics. Another controversial aspect of the game involved taking drugs instead of potions that increase or decrease attributes, but with side effects such as heart rate increase, decrease, or death. Origin Systems, the developer of the Ultima series, also released an action RPG in 1988 titled Times of Lore, which was inspired by various NES titles, particularly The Legend of Zelda. Times of Lore inspired several later titles by Origin Systems, such as the 1990 games Bad Blood, another action RPG based on the same engine, and Ultima 6, The False Prophet, based on the same interface. Also in 1989, the enhanced remakes of YS 1 and 2 was the first video games to use the CD-ROM, which was also utilized to provide enhanced graphics, animated cutscenes, a red book CD track, and voice acting. Its English localization was also one of the first to use voice dubbing. The game received the Game of the Year award from Omni Magazine in 1990, as well as other prizes. Another 1989 release, Activision's Prophecy, The Fall of Trinidad, attempted to introduce Nintendo-style action combat to North American computer role-playing games. All right, let's jump to the decade I was born, the 1990s. Action RPGs were far more common on consoles than computers, due to gamepads being better suited to real-time action than the keyboard and mouse. Though there were attempts at creating action-oriented computer RPGs during the late 1980s and early 1990s, very few saw success. Times of Lore was one of the more successful attempts in the American computer market, where there was generally a negative attitude towards combining genres in this way, and more of an emphasis on preserving the purity of the RPG genre. For example, a 1991 issue of Computer Gaming World criticized several computer role-playing games for using arcade or Nintendo-style action combat, including YS, Sorcerian, Times of Lore, and Prophecy. In 1991, Square released Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, as also known as Final Fantasy Adventure or Mystic Quest in the West, for the Game Boy. Like Crystallis, the action in Seiken Densetsu bore a strong resemblance to that of Legend of Zelda, but adding more RPG elements. It was one of the first action RPGs to allow players to just flat out kill townsfolk, though later Mana games removed this feature. Arcus Odyssey by Wolf Team, now Namco Tales Studio, was an action RPG that featured an isometric perspective and cooperative multiplayer gameplay. In 1993, the second Seiken Densetsu game, The Secret of Mana, received considerable acclaim for its innovative possible real-time action battle system and its innovative cooperative multiplayer gameplay, where the second or third players could drop in and out of the game at any time, rather than players having to join the game at the same time. The game has remained influential through the present day, with its ring menu system still used in modern games and its cooperative multiplayer mentioned as an influence to games such as Dungeon Siege 3 in 2011. Impressive. 18 years later. Most other games, however, use a side-scrolling perspective typical of beat-em-ups such as Princess Crown series, including Odin Sphere and Muramasa the Demon Blade. Princess Crown had a more cartoon-like visual appeal. It still had quality visuals due to the George Kamitani style. Another side-scrolling beat-em-up released in 1996, Garden Heroes from Treasure, a light-hearted beat-em-up with ARPG elements and multiple paths and endings. As a cult classic of the genre, it was re-released on Xbox Live Arcade in fall of 2011 and was also made backwards compatible on Xbox One on November 6, 2016. Landstalker's 1997 spiritual successor, Alundra, is considered one of the finest examples of action RPG gaming, combining platforming elements and challenging puzzles with an innovative storyline revolving around entering people's dreams and dealing with mature themes. 2000s, Ultima Underworld's influence has been found in BioShock, and that game designer Ken Levin has stated that all the things that I wanted to do and all the games that I ended up working on came out of the inspiration I took from Ultima Underworld. Gears of War designer Cliff Bleszinski also cited it as an early influence, stating that it had far more impact on me than Doom. Other games influenced by Ultima Underworld include The Elder Scrolls Arena, Deus Ex Invisible War, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and Half-Life. And now the 2010s. In 2013, Vanillaware released the fantasy beat-em-up ARPG Dragon's Crown, a spiritual successor to Princess Crown and a deeply moving product of Vanillaware director George Kamitani. Kamitani cites many classic RPGs as his inspiration. stating in the Dragon's Crown artwork forward, "The motif within Dragon's Crown is all the fantasy works that has affected me until now. The PC RPG wizardry that I first came into contact with as a student, Ian Livingstone's game books. Games like Tower of Druaga, Golden Axe, and The King of Dragons." He also cites his early 20s work on Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom as truly something that he had aspired for. Dragon's Crown was re-released with a PS4 Pro Edition in 2018. And then, of course, because this is a major subgenre, the ARPG has their own subgenres. Because why not? So the first subgenre for the ARPG would be the first-person dungeon crawl. In the late 1987, FTL Games released Dungeon Master, a dungeon crawler that had a real-time game world and some real-time combat elements, akin to the ATB system in Final Fantasy. This required players to quickly issue orders to the characters, setting the standard for first-person computer RPGs for several years. It inspired many other developers to make real-time dungeon crawlers such as Eye of the Beholder and Lands of Lore, the Throne of Chaos. Ultima Underworld, the Stygian Abyss, released in 1992 and has been cited as the first RPG to feature first-person action in a 3D environment. Ultima Underworld is considered the first example of an immersive sim, a genre that combines elements from other genres to create a game with strong player agency and emergent gameplay, and has influenced many games since its release. The engine was reused and enhanced for Ultima Underworld's 1993 sequel, Ultima Underworld 2: Labyrinth of Worlds. Looking Glass Studios planned to create a third Ultima Underworld, but Origin rejected their pitches. After Electronic Arts, EA, rejected Arcane Studios' pitch for Ultima Underworld 3, Studio instead created a spiritual successor, Arx Fatalis. Toby Gard stated that when designing Tomb Raider, he was a big fan of Ultima Underworld, and he wanted to mix that type of game with that sort of polygon characters that were just being showcased in Virtua Fighter. Ultima Underworld was also the basis for Looking Glass Technologies' later System Shock. The next subgenre is the point and click. The 1988 Origin Systems title, Times of Lore, was an action RPG with an icon-based point-and-click interface. Bad Blood, another Origin Systems game from 1990, would use the same interface. The designers were inspired by console titles, particularly The Legend of Zelda, to make their interface more accessible. The 1994 Ultima 8 used mouse controls and attempted to add precision jumping sequences reminiscent of a Mario platform game, though reactions to the game's mouse-based combat were mixed. In 1997, Blizzard's Diablo was released and became massively successful. I've actually played Diablo. I think I either had was it a disc? Did I have it on a disc or on a floppy? I think my dad had Diablo on a disc. So I've gotten to play the original Diablo back in the day. But that style of game was never really my forte. I don't necessarily like point-and-click games. But also with how popular Diablo is, I kind of want to play it. But I also don't. So it's one of those, it's just like... it's really hard to say. Let's see. Diablo was an action RPG that used a point-and-click interface and offered gamers a free online service to play with others that maintained the same rules and gameplay. Diablo's effect on the market was significant, inspiring many imitators. Its impact was such that the term action RPG had come to be more commonly used for Diablo-style games rather than Zelda-style games, with The Legend of Zelda itself recategorized as an action-adventure. I would say yes. Zelda games are more based in the action-adventure. However, I would boot Zelda 2 into the ARPG category because, once again, it's got the experience-based system with stats that are based entirely upon your leveling up, as well as items you acquire. So, but again, there's nothing wrong with something fitting into multiple different categories. Like, no game is going to stick in the exact same places that you would expect it to. It's just, you need to accept that yeah, exactly. It's just, people are always just like, ugh. I'm just like, why? Anyway, very commonly, these games used a fixed camera isometric view of the game world, a necessity of the limitations of 2D graphics of our early computers. Even with 3D graphic engines, such point-and-click games are still presented from a similar isometric view, though providing options to rotate, pan, and zoom the camera to some degree. As such, these are often grouped with other isometric RPGs. And then last but not least, of the action RPG, we have the role-playing shooter. Shooter-based action RPGs include Strife, System Shock 2, the Deus Ex series, Bungie's Destiny, Ireme's Steambot Chronicles, Square Enix's third-person shooter RPG, The Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy VII, which introduced an over-the-shoulder perspective similar to Resident Evil 4, and the MMO vehicular combat game Auto Assault by NetDevil and NCSoft. Other action RPGs featured both hack and slash and shooting elements, with the use of both guns, or in some cases, bow and arrow or aerial combat, and melee weapons, including Kavia's flight-based Drakengard series, and Level 5's Rogue Galaxy. Other role-playing shooting games include the Mass Effect series, Fallout 3 and subsequent Fallout titles, White Gold, War in Paradise, and Borderlands. Borderlands developer Gearbox Software has dubbed it as a role-playing shooter due to the heavy RPG elements within the game, such as quest-based gameplay and also its characters' traits and leveling system. Half Minute Hero, 2009, is an RPG shooter featuring self-referential humor and a 30-second time limit for each level and boss encounter. Half Minute Hero is an interesting game. I might want to play that on stream. Literally, you have 30 seconds to beat every level. That's it. 30 seconds, or you die. Actually, no, you don't die. The world ends. Other recent action role-playing games with shooter elements include the 2010 titles Alpha Protocol by Obsidian Entertainment and The Third Birthday, the third game in the Parasite Eve series. Features a unique blend of action RPG, real-time tactical RPG, survival horror, and third-person tactical shooter elements. More recent shooter-based RPGs include Image Pooch's Image Epoch's post-apocalyptic Black Rock shooter, which employs both first-person and third-person shooter elements, and Square Enix's Final Fantasy XV, which features both hack and slash and third-person shooter elements. Yeah, it's really hard. By the way, that was everything for the ARPG. It's really hard to just say, you've got, let's pull several different things together. Let's throw in Deus Ex, Human Revolution. Let's throw up Borderlands, Final Fantasy 15, and Mass Effect 3. Now let's compare all of those games. And would you really be able to say that those are all action RPGs just based upon looking at all of those? Because they feel so different, Even comparing likes to likes. Let's compare Borderlands to Mass Effect, Those are incredibly similar, you got abilities that you get when you level up, you got guns. Okay, that's all the similarities, but they also at the same time feel and play different, you know? Mass Effect's got that morality system. Borderlands has, you know, that same gun, except for it's got a different barrel, therefore it's actually completely different. But, like, they don't feel like they belong in the role-playing shooter together, but yet they do, you know? It's weird. But also, that's what's so nice, is the fact that you've got different people realizing different styles of the same style, you know? It allows for someone who's like, I love Borderlands, but I detest Mass Effect, you know? And that's okay, because you're still able to experience and enjoy the same style of gameplay. And then, of course, obviously, you know, if other things aren't necessarily your cup of tea, you've got that option to be like, well, I don't want to play it. Okay, well, don't. Okay, so we're going to jump a little bit because we only got 20 minutes. So we're going to jump to the open world subgenre of the RPG. So, in video games, an open world is a game mechanic of using a virtual world that the player can explore and approach objectives freely, as opposed to a world with more linear and structured gameplay. While games have used open world designs since the 1980s, the implementation in Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2001 set a standard that has been used since. God, I can't believe 2001 was 20 years ago. I was just like, man, I turned 9 in 2001. And then I'm just like, man, that was 20 years ago. Jesus. Games with open or free roaming worlds typically lack level structures like walls in locked games, or the invisible walls in more open areas that prevent the player from venturing beyond them. Only at the bounds of an open world game will the players be limited by geographic features like vast oceans or impassable mountains. Players typically do not encounter loading screens common in linear level designs when moving about the game world, with the open world game using strategic storage and memory techniques to load the game world in a dynamic and seamless manner. Open world games still enforce many restrictions in the game environment, either because absolute technical limitations or in-game limitations imposed by the game's linearity. While the openness of the game world is an important facet to games featuring open worlds, the main draw of open world games is about providing the player with autonomy, not so much the freedom to do anything they want in the game, which is nearly impossible with current computing technology, but the ability to choose how to approach the game and its challenges in the order and manner as the player desires, while still constrained by gameplay rules. Examples of high-level autonomy in computer games can be found in massively multiplayer online role-playing games, or in single-player games adhering to open-world concepts such as the Fallout series. The main appeal of open-world gameplay is that they provide a simulated reality that allow players to develop their character and its behavior in the direction and pace of their choosing. In these cases, there is no concrete goal or end to the game, although there may be the main storyline, such as games like The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, which at some point I do still plan on doing a series of, oh my god, I just modded the hell out of this game, what are we playing? First playthrough. Gameplay and design. An open world is a level or game designed as non-linear, open areas with many ways to reach an objective. Some games are designed with both traditional and open world levels. An open world facilitates greater exploration than a series of smaller levels, or a level with more linear challenges. Reviewers have judged the quality of an open world based on whether there are interesting ways for the players to interact with the broader level when they ignore the main objective. Some games actually use real settings to model an open world, such as New York City. A very good example of this would definitely be Deus Ex: Mankind Divided, where, you know, I mean, just the fact that you can do things in a non-lethal manner versus a lethal manner on the open world map, not just in levels, really shows, the capabilities of an open world system. It's like, oh, you can go, like one of our first missions, and Mankind Divided, is to go see the guy who's going to be maintaining our robotic body, And obviously he's currently being assailed by mobsters. Now, you can kill the mobsters, find his secret door, open it by going through the front door. You can come in through the roof. You can come in through the window. You can actually break in through the sewers, But also, not just that, but there's actually an achievement for, he asks you to go get him a certain item a couple of missions later on. However, before you even meet him the first time, you can go get that item and sequence break the game intentionally. Simply because if you're exploring, it might be something you end up doing accidentally, It's just having it open, So, anyway, back to this. A major design challenge is to balance the freedom of an open world with the structure of a dramatic storyline. Some players may perform actions that the game designer did not expect. The game writers must find creative ways to impose a storyline on the player without interfering with their freedom. As such, games with open worlds will sometimes break the game's story into a series of missions, or having a much simpler storyline altogether. Although games instead offer side missions to the player that do not disrupt the main storyline. Most open-world games make the character a blank slate that players can project their own thoughts onto, although several games such as Landstalker, The Treasures of King Noel, offer more character development and dialogue. Writing in 2005, David Barbin described the narrative structure of current video games as little different to the stories of those Harold Lloyd films of the 1920s, and considered genuinely open-ended stories to be the holy grail we are looking for in the fifth generation gaming. Gameplay designer Manveer Air, who worked on Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect Andromeda for Electronic Arts, said that there are difficulties in the design of an open-world game since it's difficult to predict how players will approach solving gameplay challenges offered by a design, in contrast to a linear progression. It needs to be factored in the game's development from the onset. Air opined that some of the critical failings of Andromeda were due to the open world being added late in development. And I would agree with that. If you're going to go with the open world style, that has to be factored in from the get-go. Because if you do not consider the fact that the player is going to be able to do whatever they want, wherever they want, whenever they want, something is going to break. Because it's just not going to be it's not viable, I mean, just look at me. How many times have I broken things just because I decided to explore and jump? Dragon Age Inquisition. I jumped on a roof and accidentally discovered a clip falling through a goddamn ceiling. Getting myself stuck in a banister and then being yeeted out into oblivion. And I mean, that's something, it was supposed to be open world. You do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, wherever you want. Because of all that, it's just like, and there's lots of other things, but if you're considering it from the get-go, you can handle it a lot better than if you're like, 70% into the game, and then you're like, you know what players would love? If this was open world, so we're going to do that now. And the developers are like, what? This doesn't work anymore. You have to redo the entire thing. Oh, I should mention that we're shipping the game in 3 months. And that is why Andromeda was hated. Because it got severely rushed. Though, to be completely honest, I do not remember it. After playing it for 170 hours, I do not remember the game. Which is why it's going to be fun to play it again soon. Yay! But anyway, going back to here. Some open world games, to guide the player towards major story events, do not provide the world's entire map at the start of the game, but require the player to complete a task to obtain part of that map, often identifying missions and points of interest when they view the map. This has been derogatorily referred to as Ubisoft Towers, as the mechanic was promoted in Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed series. The player climbing a large tower as to observe the landscape around it to identify waypoints nearby, and reused in other Ubisoft games, including Far Cry, Might and Magic 10, Legacy, and Watch Dogs. Other games that use this approach include Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, and Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Okay, so I both like and dislike this mechanic. So, easy to compare for you, Emotive. So you remember when we climbed up those towers in Breath of the Wild, and then we put our thingy down inside that tower, and it a good chunk of the map was revealed while we were up there, right? That's not a bad idea. It guides players to certain points to be like, hey, you want to know more? Come here. And then, we'll, show the map to you. That's not bad. However, what I dislike about that is I could go exploring for 20 minutes north of the tower. And according to my map, I did nothing other than walk there. I didn't find anything, nothing. Not a zilch. It's one of those, a system where you can either go to the tower or you can reveal parts of the map as you walk. Because I just feel like both of those are very realistic. You're going to climb up a tower and take a look around to get your bearings, right? Sure. But you also have a map. And you'd fill in your map as you go, realistically, oh, wow, right next to this poop-shaped mountain and this broken tree that looks like a dildo, I found a pack of wild horses. So this is an area where wild horses are, You'd fill that in yourself. Actually, I'd fill in the fact that I found a poop mountain and a tree shaped like a dildo, but that's a different story. But the map would fill naturally just because you experienced it. And I think that's something that they should incorporate. That way it's not just necessarily, to see the map, you must climb this tower. It's sure, if you want faster ease of access to be able to I want to go here. Or, hey, I'm looking for, a mountain surrounded by 2 rivers. But I can't see this mountain surrounded by 2 rivers, but I'm pretty sure I walked past it at some point, but I haven't gone to the tower here. You'd be able to see the mountain surrounded by 2 rivers, whatever. Anyway. Continuing on. Games with open worlds typically give players infinite lives or continues, although some force the player to start at the beginning should they die too many times. There's also a risk that players may get lost if they explore an open world. Thus, designers sometimes try to break the open world into manageable sections. The scope of open world games requires the developer to fully detail every possible section of the world the player may be able to access, unless methods like procedural generation are used. The design process, due to its scale, may leave numerous game world glitches, bugs, incomplete sections, or other irregularities, and players may find and potentially take advantage of. The term open world jank has been used to apply to games where the incorporation of the open world gameplay elements may be poor, incomplete, or unnecessary to the game itself, such that these glitches and bugs become more apparent, though are generally not game breaking. Such is the case of No Man's Sky near its launch. A good use of an open world system, but it's actually closed off, would be Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. So for the first half of the game, you can only access half of the map. Now, I'd say for the first third of the game, you can only access half of the map. The second third of the game, you can only access the second half of the map. And then that last third of the game, you can access the entire map as a whole put together. It's just, they're like, hey, we want you to be able to do whatever you want, but we want to limit you to right here for now. And I think that's a nice step, but whatever. Anyway, open world sandbox games and emergent gameplay. The mechanics of open world games are often overlapped with ideas of sandbox games, but these are considered different terms. Whereas open world refers to the lack of limits for the player's exploration of the game's world, sandbox games are based on the ability of giving the players tools for creative freedom with the game to approach objectives, if such objectives are present. For example, Microsoft Flight Simulator is an open-world game, as one can fly anywhere within the mapped world, but is not considered a sandbox game as there are few creative aspects brought into the game. Funnily enough, someone modded Microsoft Flight Simulator to include the cargo ship that was blocking the Suez Canal. Just fun fact. The combination of open world and sandbox mechanics can lead towards emergent gameplay. Complex reactions that emerge either expectedly or unexpectedly from the interaction of relatively simple game mechanics. According to Peter Molyneux, emergent gameplay appears whenever a game has a good simulation system that allows players to play in the world and have it respond realistically to their actions. It is what made SimCity and The Sims compelling to players. Similarly, being able to freely interact with the city's inhabitants in Grand Theft Auto added an extra dimension to the series. In recent years, game designers have attempted to encourage emergent gameplay by providing players with tools to expand games through their own actions. Examples include in-game web browsers in EVE Online and The Matrix Online, XML integration tools and programming languages in Second Life, shifting exchange rates in Entropia Universe, and the complex object and grammar system used to solve puzzles in Scribblenauts. Okay, I think Scribblenauts is incredibly amazing. Just for the fact that it can recognize so much. It's just mind-boggling. But other examples of emergence including interactions between physics and artificial intelligence. One challenge that remains to be solved, however, is how to tell a compelling story using emergent technology. And an op-ed piece for BBC News, David Barbin, co-creator of Elite, called truly open-ended game design the holy grail of modern gaming, citing games like Elite and Grand Theft Auto series as early steps in that direction. Peter Molyneux has also stated that he believes emergence, or emergent gaming, is where video game development is headed in the future. He has attempted to implement open-world gameplay to a great extent in some of his games, particularly Black and White and Fable. Yeah, I see Fable with that. Procedural generation of open worlds. Procedural generation refers to content generated algorithmically rather than manually, and is often used to generate some levels and other content. While procedural generation does not guarantee that a game or sequence of levels is non-linear, it is an important factor in reducing game development time and opens up avenues, making it possible to generate larger and more or less unique, seamless game worlds on the fly and using fewer resources. This kind of procedural generation is known as world building, in which general rules are used to construct a believable world. Most 4X and roguelike games make use of procedural generation to some extent to generate some levels. SpeedTree is an example of developer-oriented tool used in the development of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, and aimed at speeding up the level design process. Procedural generation also made it possible for the developers of Elite to fit the entire game, including thousands of planets, dozens of trade commodities, multiple ship types, and a plausible economic system, into less than 22 kilobytes of memory. More recently, No Man's Sky procedurally generated over 18 quintillion planets, including flora, fauna, and other features that can be researched and explored. That is ridiculous. 18 quintillion fucking planets. Let's go. All right. But I think that's where we'll leave off. We will look at the history of open world first next week. And then jump into the MUD, the MMORPG, the roguelike, the tactical role-playing game, and we'll end it off with the tiny 2 sentences on Monster Tamer RPGs. But anyway, that's going to be it for us today. I hope you all enjoyed this quick look at RPGs, and we will continue with this again, of course, next week. But anyway, thank you everybody for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and until the next time, everybody, stay funky, people.